In this Innistrad Remastered draft guide, I will be providing all of the information you need to know before diving into your first draft. I will be covering the top commons for each color, archetype overviews, combat tricks to be aware of, traps to avoid, combos you can assemble, and more. Kicking things off with the top commons, starting with white. At number 1 is Thraben Inspector. This innocuous little 1-drop just comes in and gets you on the board while also providing a clue that you can sacrifice later for getting your card back. And if you ever trade Thraben Inspector for a card, like something that has 1 toughness or things like that, then you have come out ahead on the exchange, and your Thraben Inspector was really cheap to deploy. It might not look like much, but it is excellent and a card you should prioritize. At number 2 is Bound by Moonsilver. It's a removal spell that you can move around to whichever threat is the most pertinent at the time. Now, you will have to sacrifice a permanent to do that, but sometimes that's not even that bad once you get to the late game, and the fact that you can early on kill your opponent's creature that really matters, and then later on kill their creature that matters even more means that this is a really nice card. And then at number 3 is Abyssinian Priest. This is similar to Bound by Moonsilver in that it scales with the game very well. In the early turns, you can tap down your opponent's best attacker, and the same holds true for the late game as long as it is not a human. There are a lot of big things that aren't humans in this set, and Abyssinian Priest is going to be really good in most of the matchups you will face. Next up is blue. At number 1 is Towergeist. This card is absolutely unreal at common. For 4 mana, you get a reasonably sized flyer and also get card advantage and card selection, and you get to fill your graveyard a little bit. All of that is really, really good in this set, and Towergeist is a card you should really be prioritizing as a result. Absolutely excellent. At number 2 is Lantern Bearer. This is a small little flyer, but it does have the disturb mechanic, which means that once it dies or goes to your graveyard for some other reason, you can cast it for 3 mana as Lantern's Lift, which buffs up one of your creatures and gives it flying, which gives you a lot of versatility with Lantern Bearer and is definitely a card that you're going to want to prioritize as a result. And then finally, we have Think Twice, just a nice little way to get some card advantage, and is especially good if you can get it into the graveyard without having to cast the first part of the card, because then you just get to flash it back, and it's almost like you get an extra resource because you didn't have to invest the mana up front. And so this card plays really well in a graveyard format like Innistrad Remastered. Next is black. At number 1 is Ecstatic Awakener. This card is absolutely fantastic. It, again, looks relatively innocuous, but when you have another creature to sacrifice, which you can oftentimes build in creatures that are looking to be sacrificed or are pretty happy to die, or you'll have cards that care about if you have creatures die on your turn, so Ecstatic Awakener can enable those. You can pay 3 mana, sacrifice it, draw a card, so you don't go down on a resource, and flip this into a 4/4, which is just a really large body. And if you can even do that in the early turns of the game, maybe on turn 1 play Ecstatic Awakener, turn 2 play a card you're willing to sacrifice, turn 3 flip it, you just have a big creature that's able to attack and block and interact in combat way ahead of schedule. At number 2 is Gissa's Bidding. This is 4 mana for 2/2/2 creatures, which is already reasonable, but it gets really good when you can Madness it, because Madness means that if you discard it, you can cast it for its Madness cost. So you can do this for 3 mana if you can curve into it with Madness enablers. And you can also just use this as a way to discard it for extra value with one of your cards, and then also get to cast the Gissa's Bidding. So that's a nice little 1-2 punch if you have some discard outlets as well. Then at number 3 is Eaten Alive. It plays really well with cards that want to be sacrificed or good sacrifice fodder, and also can be cast for 5 mana. And the fact that it exiles is especially relevant in this format because this is a graveyard set, so getting rid of threats permanently can be a big deal. Next up is red. At number 1 is Abrade. Just really rock solid removal spell. 2 mana, deal 3 damage, instant speed. You can also kill artifacts sometimes if that is relevant, and overall just a card that you're going to be happy to prioritize. At number 2 is Blood Petal Celebrant, a card that you'll be pretty happy to have in your aggressive decks. A 2 mana 2/1 first striker when it's attacking is pretty reasonable, and the fact that it dies into a blood token means that in the mid to late game, you're going to be able to get rid of extra lands that you don't need to keep finding action. And number 3 is Seize the Storm, and while this card won't fit into every red deck, in the red decks where it's good, it is so excellent that it can often be worth speculating on early, because for 5 mana you can get just an absolutely massive creature if you have a bunch of instants and sorceries in your deck, and it even has flashback, so you can get 2 massive creatures. So really a nice card to be able to have access to in red. Next up is green, and number 1 is Eccentric Farmer. Just a really nice 3-drop to not only get you some value by finding you a land, but also fill your graveyard and start fueling your graveyard synergies, while also helping you hit your land drops. So Eccentric Farmer is really nice. Spore Crawler at number 2. It's sometimes a little bit finicky to get the card out of this, because your opponent can just take some damage, or they can chump block it, or they can block it with a 1/4, or things like that. But the fact that you have a 3-drop that sticks on the battlefield, and your opponent has to give you a card if they trade with it or interact with it, means it's a 2-for-1 waiting to happen, and really nice. Then at number 3 is Ambush Viper. This is just a really nice flash creature. You can use it mid-combat to kill your opponent's big attackers, and Death Touch is just a really nice ability to have access to. So Ambush Viper coming in at number 3. Moving on to the color rankings, at number 1 is blue. Tower Geist is a really, really good common and kind of carries blue in that and just has a bunch of other solid commons, even other than the ones I was able to show. White similarly has a lot of depth, a lot of removal, a lot of good card quality. Black, also the same thing, just a lot of color cards that are very strong and also has some exiles, some graveyard synergies, and even some typal synergies with zombies and things like that. Green, a little bit lower. It doesn't have great removal spells, but it has some really good card quality in terms of the card advantage you can get from the creatures that we already looked at in the top commons. And then red coming in at number 5. It's not unplayable, and this is more of a tiebreaker than anything, but if you have the choice, red is a little bit lower on the power level, mostly because it doesn't have that depth of commons that the other colors have access to in terms of quality after the first couple. Next up are the archetype overviews, starting off with red-white. This is an aggressive strategy, a fairly typical red archetype. Markov Waltzer is really nice because it comes in It's a 4-mana 1/3 that can buff your creatures to enable your attacks. So if you have a couple of smaller creatures, the Markov Waltzer can ensure they are able to keep attacking, and it has haste itself, so it can chip in for damage as well. Gather the Townsfolk is a nice addition with the Markov Waltzer because it gives you a couple of things to target to enable the attacks, and if you are in a big racing situation, so you're low on life, that Fateful Hour can come in clutch and get you a bunch of tokens all at once, especially relevant with Rally the Peasants, which is a card that red-white has access to and can really leverage in a unique way by casting it and flashing it back on the same turn to give all of your creatures +4/+0. That is definitely something to be aware of in your red-white decks. So if you have Rally the Peasants in your deck, maybe just try to avoid trades and draw until you can get that Rally the Peasants, because then you're going to be able to turn all of your creatures into monsters. Next up is blue-black. This is a control deck that also has some zombie sub-themes. So Blade Stitch Scab is a 2-mana 2/3, already a good creature size, and also buffs your other zombies. Drunau Corpse Trawler is also really good, comes in, makes a zombie friend, and can give your zombies Death Touch to ensure favorable trades on defense or enable some attacks. And then Compelling Deterrence is a fantastic card if you have zombies, because it bounces your opponent's creature and makes them discard a card. So it's going to give you a tempo advantage and not even put you down a card with the bounce spell. So really nice cards in blue-black. Next is green-white. This is an aggressive deck that can leverage some human synergies and also Travel Preparations, which is an absolutely stellar card. Travel Preparations means that any 2 creatures you have can be turned into much more sizable threats on turn 4, and your opponent is going to either have to have removal spells that can take down these newly enhanced creatures or have some Death Touch or other way to deal with them in combat, because it's very unlikely that they're going to have creatures with enough stats to deal with them on their own. So Travel Preparations is excellent, and one of the best reasons to draft green-white. Plays especially well with mechanics such as flying or lifelink, because then you get extra value from those stats. Join the Dance is another really good card for green-white. Makes you a couple humans, and then you can flash it back for even more humans, and that plays great with Hamlet Captain, which is a human payoff, where when it attacks or blocks other humans you control get +1/+1 until end of turn. So you can play your Join the Dance and your Hamlet Captain, then attack with the Hamlet Captain and buff all those Join the Dance tokens. Maybe use Travel Prep to buff up the Hamlet Captain to enable its attacks. Overall, just a really nice synergistic aggressive deck. Next is blue-red. This is a deck that cares about casting non-creature spells and filling your deck with instants and sorceries. Wandering Mind is a really good 3-drop because it's a card that comes into play, can chip in for some damage in the skies, and also finds you gives you a lot of card selection when it comes to finding a non-creature, non-land card from the top 6 cards of your library. Rise from the Tides can be a really good win condition for this deck, because if you fill your deck with instants and sorceries, you can make an astronomical number of zombies and just overwhelm your opponent. And then Mystic Retrieval is a cool card for this deck to help you win the late game and really get max value out of your key instants and sorceries, because you can use it to buy back the ones that you care about. And even if you discard it or mill it in the early turns of the game, then Mystic Retrieval can still be used for its flashback cost. So that's a nice upside to have in your blue-red deck, giving you some nice little selection once you've filled your graveyard. Next is black-green. This is a deck that cares about filling your graveyard and also has a little bit of a death triggers theme as well. Spider Spawning is an absolutely key card for this deck. It's one of the best things that you can be doing in the late game, is just cast Spider Spawning with a bunch of creatures in your graveyard and then flash it back and just have an army of spiders. It's very, very strong, and especially plays well with cards like Splinter Fright, which lets you mill 2 cards at the beginning of every turn's upkeep. So you're able to fill your graveyard and then cast something like Spider Spawning. Even if you mill it over, it has flashback, so making all those spiders is really, really good. And Splinter Fright, of course, grows as well. And then you also gain access to a card like Grizzly Ghoul, as well as some other cards that care about having creatures die. And so a card like Grizzly Ghoul, you really want to be using this once you're able to attack and trade off in combat, because it comes in with based on each creature that died, not just your own creatures, not just your opponent's creatures. So if you're able to trade in combat, it'll come in with 2 counters on it and things of that nature. So sometimes sacrifice effects can be used to help enable these sorts of cards, and sometimes you'll just want to make your opponent go into situations where they have to trade. Next is white-blue. This is a deck that cares about spirits and flying and kind of racing in the skies a little bit. Spectral Shepherd is a really good card for this deck because it lets you protect your other spirits from removal, including itself. You can target it with its own ability to make it so your opponent's removal is a little bit weaker if you are able to put the pressure on them in the skies. This just means that they're not really going to be able to answer your threats and will have to race you, which is sometimes a thing they're not able to do, especially if they're playing a more controlling deck. Lunarch Veteran might not look like the perfect card for this deck because it's not a spirit on the front half of the card, but the life gain that this gives you really does help you win those racing situations that a Flyers deck often can struggle in, and it can get it in the way of a big creature, chump block, and then come back as Luminous Phantom, which is a flyer that can help chip in and also help you win the race by gaining you some life when your creatures leave the battlefield. And also, it's a really cool combo with Spectral Shepherd because if you then bounce Luminous Phantom back to your hand, you can then replay the front half of the card. So that is a cool synergy to be aware of. And then Nebelgast Herald is a way to tap down your opponent's attacker at instant speed, so you can help win your racing situations while also chipping through in the sky and making all of your other spirits a lot better. It's also a good synergy with Spectral Shepherd. Once you get to that stage of the game where you have a bunch of mana, you just bounce the Nebelgast Herald, play it again, and tap your opponent's creatures down for quite some time. So these little synergies are what you're going to need if you want to win with these blue-white decks, because every point of damage is going to matter in those situations. Next up is red-green. This is a deck that cares about wolves, and werewolves. So a card like Ulrich's Kindred is really, really nice in this deck as a 3-mana 3/2 with trample that can also give your attacking wolves and werewolves indestructible so that your opponent really can't deal with them in combat. It's worth noting that this is a real threat of activation. So if you attack while you have this 4-mana up, your opponent really can't block. And so you don't actually have to use the ability on this card for it to be very, very good. Next is Gyre Reach Bandit. This is a cool werewolf that has haste, so it comes down, hits your opponent immediately, and if no spells were cast in a turn, you can transform it into the Vilden Pack Alpha, which makes all of your werewolves come into the battlefield transformed, which is absolutely stellar, especially because there's some really werewolves in this set that have really expensive activations to flip them, and so if you can have that Vilden Pack Alpha in play, you're going to get a lot of mana saved by playing those cards. And then Moonlight Hunt is another card you have access to that other decks aren't going to be as interested in, because you're going to have enough wolves and werewolves that you're going to be able to use this as an efficient removal spell, where other decks might struggle to use it effectively. So you'll be able to pick these up a little bit later and have a premium removal spell. Next is white-black. This deck is going to be fantastic with Lingering Souls when you can get those, especially multiple copies of it, because Lingering Souls is just a messed up card in Limited. You just make a huge number of flyers for one card, and that can really just fuel your entire deck, and you can just win with those cards in some matchups just on their own. Flesh Taker is a good way to use those tokens if the 1/1s aren't going to be good enough on their own. You can sacrifice them to gain a life, scry 1, buff up the Flesh Taker, and then Mausoleum Guard is kind of the poor man's Lingering Souls in some ways. It gives you a 2/2 creature, dies into 2/1/1. So if you have those sacrifice fodder things, some cards that need you to sacrifice cards, and you're just trying to clog up the ground and then win in the skies with your tokens, Mausoleum Guard can really fit into that synergy as well. And the fact that it dies into 2/1/1s means that you're going to be able to pressure your opponent in the skies once the guard trades off or gets sacrificed to an effect. Next is blue-green. This is a deck that cares about the graveyard. Vile Spawn Spider is excellent. It mills you a card at the beginning of each upkeep, and then you can sacrifice it to make insects for each creature card in your graveyard. So if you can fill your graveyard up a ton, you can get a bunch of insect tokens. Ghoul Tree is another really cool card for this deck because it just can get cast for really cheap relatively early in the game if you are able to mill a bunch of creature cards. And even just in the mid to late game, if you can just double spell with this and just have a 10/10 in play, that's a huge amount of stats, even if it doesn't have any other abilities. And then Covetous Castaway is a really cool card for this deck because when it dies, you get to mill 3 cards to fuel your synergies, and if you mill it from something else, you can also use the Disturb ability. When you cast the Disturb, you can shuffle 3 cards from your graveyard into your library to just increase your card quality a little bit while also getting a nice threat. So Covetous Castaway, a really good piece of this puzzle as well. Next is black-red. This is a deck that cares about madness. So Fiery Temper is really like the poster child type card that you're going to be looking for, where you can discard it and play it for its madness cost to deal 3 to any target. So you're just getting access to Lightning Bolt in your deck if you can fill your deck with some discard enablers. Olivia's Dragoon is a fantastic discard enabler because it doesn't cost any mana at all to use that discard ability. So if you have madness cards in your deck, the Dragoon is fantastic because you just discard your cards and then cast them for their madness cost without having to pay extra mana for the Dragoon's ability. It's also a vampire, and there is some vampire synergies in black-red. Blood Tithe Harvester kind of ties all of this together. It's a 2-mana 3/2, so that's already good stats. It makes a blood token, which can be sacrificed to let you discard a card, which can also fuel your madness synergies. And also it has the ability to be a small removal spell on its own. So Blood Tithe Harvester is the great card for this deck. Next up are some combat tricks to be aware of at common. In white, there is Strength of Arms for 1 mana, giving +2/+2. Spontaneous Mutation in blue is kind of a removal spell, kind of a combat trick, but it can also be the sort of thing where your opponent uses it to shrink your creature in combat and then wins the combat because of that. Tragic Slip is also kind of a removal spell, kind of a combat trick, where they can shrink your creature in combat to use it as a combat trick, but also if they make a suspicious attack, it could be because they're trying to Tragic Slip one of your key cards. So sometimes it's worth taking damage if you think they have Tragic Slip. Borrowed Hostility can give +3/+0 and First Strike if your opponent escalates it, or it can give one or the other. And then Aim High can untap a creature and give it +2/+2 and reach. So a lot of little minor things with Aim High that can make it problematic. So even if your opponent's creature is tapped, if you think they have Aim High, you might want to be a little bit wary. And then there are some cards that aren't exactly combat tricks, but are kind of relevant. So Cathar Commando having Flash can definitely throw a wrench in your plans. Drogskrull Shieldmate can also throw a wrench in your plans because giving your other creatures +0/+1 until end of turn can definitely be a factor at instant speed because it has Flash. Essence Flux can exile a creature and then return it to play and give it a counter if it's a spirit. So sometimes if they have a tapped spirit, Essence Flux can maybe give it a counter and let it block, or just a big tapped creature, they can use Essence Flux. And then Ambush Viper, we already discussed. Flash, and also just being able to a Death Touch creature kind of makes this a removal spell of sorts in combat that you need to be aware of. Next up are some traps to avoid. Faithless Looting is the sort of card that is fantastic in Constructed, and so players often think it is also fantastic in Limited, and it's definitely a card that you can play sometimes if you have some synergies, particularly if you have some Madness cards you're trying to enable, but this isn't just the sort of slam dunk card where you're like, oh, this card was banned in Constructed formats, therefore it has to be stellar and Limited. That doesn't translate 1-to-1, and Faithless Looting is not a high priority card for your deck. Lupine Prototype is another card that's easy to go like, wow, it's a 2-mana 5/5. But the downside is real with this one. Not being able to attack or block unless a player has no cards in hand is really going to limit where this card can be applied. And oftentimes it's just a card you're going to want to leave on the bench. And then Intangible Virtue, even if you have some token makers in your deck, is not a card that you're really going to want to be playing because you're not going to really ever have enough tokens to make this card worthwhile. If you have a couple of token makers, you'd rather just play another card that can be used in the cases where you don't draw your token makers to still have a good effect on the game. Because even if you're just buffing up a couple of your tokens, a lot of the time you're going to be able to get a more effective card into that slot. And so Intangible Virtue, another card that even if it's good in some situations where you're like, oh, if I have all these Lingering Souls tokens in play, this Virtue could be good. A lot of the time, and by a lot of the time I mean pretty much every single time, you're going to want to just leave that one on the sidelines instead and play a card that's relevant when you don't draw your Lingering Souls. Moving on to some combos you can assemble with just commons and uncommons. First up is a big one, Graph Rats plus Midnight Scavenger. This is a classic meld combo, so if you can get both of these cards into play at the beginning of combat on your turn, if you own and control both of them, then you can meld them into the Chittering Host, which is just a really big creature, and you're going to be able to get a big swing in because it has haste and menace and buffs your other creatures, which is pretty cool. Next up is the combo between Mentor of the Meek and Cathar's Call. So Mentor of the Meek lets you pay 1 mana to draw a card whenever another creature you control with power 2 or less enters. And then Cathar's Call says at the beginning of your end step, create a 1/1 white human creature token. So at the beginning of each end step, you'll make a 1/1, you can pay 1 mana to your Mentor of the Meek, and then you can draw a card. So it's kind of nice because Cathar's Call inherently sets you up to get 2 for 1, but if you can put Cathar's Call onto a creature while you have Mentor of the Meek, you can get cards while you're getting those 1/1s, which is absolutely fantastic. Next up is the combo between Fiend Hunter and Essence Flux. This one is a little bit tricky to understand, but it's based on the way the clauses are worded with Fiend Hunter. So basically the way Fiend Hunter works is it has 2 clauses. The first one is when it enters, you can exile another target creature, and the second one is when it leaves the battlefield, return the exiled card to the battlefield under its owner's control. And because they are worded as 2 separate clauses, if you play Fiend Hunter and then with the ability on the stack cast Essence Flux, the Fiend Hunter will leave play. The leave play ability will go on the stack. There will not be a creature to return because of the leave play ability, and then the enters effect will go onto the stack, and so you'll get to exile a creature. And then the Fiend Hunter will return into play with Essence Flux, and you'll get to exile another creature, and in that case, that creature will return once you have that Fiend Hunter killed. So basically, if you didn't understand all of the lingo that I was using and all of the rules knowledge, basically, if you play Fiend Hunter and then with its ability on the stack, use with the ability to target something on the stack, use Essence Flux, you get to exile the creature that you're targeting with it permanently, and then you get to exile something else when Fiend Hunter returns into play. It's a really cool combo. Definitely a little bit weird with the rules, but it does work, and it's definitely something you should be aware of when you're playing white-blue with your Fiend Hunter and Essence Flux. And then finally, we have the combo between Laboratory Maniac and Grapple with the Past. Laboratory Maniac is the sort of card that looks like it might just be a dream that you can't ever live, but there are lots of ways to mill cards in this format. We've already looked at several cards that let you mill cards every single turn, and so you can get into these late game situations where you are able to have an empty deck. and Laboratory Maniac can win you the game. And in those situations, a card like Grapple with the Past is fantastic, because that means that if Laboratory Maniac had died or been milled into your graveyard earlier in the game, you'll have access to it with your Grapple the Past, because you mill 3 cards and you can return any creature or land card from your graveyard to your hand with the Grapple. It doesn't just have to be the cards that get exiled with that get milled with Grapple the Past. So that's a really good synergy to be aware of as well. Moving on to the mana fixing available at common, Evolving Wilds is going to be doing a lot of work. It's available to any color, and you can just sacrifice it to search your library for a basic land card and put it into play tapped. It's worth noting that if you are playing a deck that mills itself quite a bit, you might want to play an extra copy of the basic land you'd like to search, because if you mill the copy, then Evolving Wilds can't get it from your graveyard. Traveler's Amulet, kind of similar to Evolving Wilds. You play it, then you can pay another mana to sacrifice it, get a basic land card. Wildfield Scarecrow is a little bit vulnerable sometimes. If you play it for 3 mana and your opponent kills it before you can sacrifice it, you can't get the lands with it, but a lot of the time you can sack it to get 2 basic land cards to your hand. And then Abundant Growth is in green and lets you enchant one of your lands cantrip by drawing a card, and also lets that land tap for a mana of any color. So those are the fixing that you're going to have access to at common. Moving on to some final tips. The first one is that the graveyard is critical, so keep an eye out for cards that exile. We already mentioned that a little bit with some removal spells that exile, but any card that exiles threats from your opponent is going to be relevant, because there are cards that have flashback, there are cards that return cards from your graveyard, and there are things of that nature, or cards that care about how many of a card are in their graveyard. There's all sorts of cards that care about the graveyard, and so things like Syncopate that exile the spells when they get cast, things that exile the threats from the battlefield are going to be relevant, and you should keep an eye out for those cards. And then finally, play carefully and read your cards. There are a lot of mechanics in this set. Make sure that you understand that what your own cards do, make sure you understand what your opponent's cards do, and just take that extra second, even if it makes you feel a little bit silly to say, hey, can I read your card again if you've already read it, or things like that. Just take that extra time, be careful, know what things do, because it's really painful to lose games or put yourself at a disadvantage because you weren't willing to take that extra time to just fully understand what every card does, count up how many of each type are in their graveyard, in your graveyard, make sure you really understand the math and all of the decisions so that you can have more fun playing and not just fall victim to just blundering because you don't know what the cards do. So play carefully, read your cards. It's going to be a lot of fun as long as you know what's going on. Anyway, that is going to do it for this video. Thank you so much for watching. Remember to hit the thumbs up button, subscribe, and comment if you have any questions or feedback, and leave hashtag INNISTRADRafter in the comments section down below to let me know you made it all the way till the end of the video. I hope you enjoyed this video. I hope you're excited for this set, and I hope you have a ton of fun drafting Innistrad Remastered.